The federal government has announced plans to replace its international student cap with slowed visa processing. Under the new Ministerial Direction, processing will be split into two categories: high priority and standard priority, instead of capping numbers. Joining me live now to break this all down is International Education Association Chief Executive Officer Phil Honeywood. Phil, thanks so much for your time this afternoon. Is this change welcome news for Australian universities?
Evening, Christy. Well, we want policy clarity, and what we've had is a hiatus since the opposition combined with the Greens to block the relevant limited enrolment legislation, the cap legislation that it's called, in the Senate. And we've had a real problem ever since then in terms of getting clarity so that students know they can still come to Australia in okay numbers.
And regional universities in particular have been quite critical of the cap itself. Will this new plan be more beneficial for those regional areas and smaller universities?
Happily, the government are going to give priority to regional universities. More importantly, what was happening before was that the lowest risk universities, the group of 8 as we call them, they were getting the lion's share of the visas being processed very quickly. And it meant that the other universities, including the regional ones who were regarded as a bit higher risk technically, were actually way behind in the queue. And it also meant that we got almost incredible numbers out of the lowest risk countries like China, but we're getting very little student visas approved out of the subcontinent. So we're going to have more diversity of student countries coming into the nation now, and also a fairer share of the pie, so to speak, for students coming to a range of universities and quality private colleges.
You mentioned there that the previous direction gave priority to students from low-risk nations. What determined that risk factor?
It's a very technical issue, which is often a fairly blunt instrument, because what it is financial documentation, academic documentation, putting additional filters over making sure that English language entry standards are appropriate. And according to those different levels that are applied by Home Affairs Department, it does require a university to go for a lot of hoops in terms of getting students from a number of countries that we rely on heavily.
Just how reliant exactly are universities on international students?
It's Victoria's biggest industry, South Australia's biggest industry, way ahead of mining, ahead of agriculture in those two states. And about 1/3 to a half of the revenue for our public universities, 39 public universities, is reliant on the tuition fees, which are 3 times more on average than what a domestic Australian student would pay. And so, unfortunately, every government since the Menzies government in Australia has just turned a blind eye to the fact that they're not paying the universities enough to survive, and they've left it to the universities to make money in other ways and thereby charge international students a premium to get a world-class qualification they can take anywhere in the world. Bear in mind, Christy, that 82% of those students go home, and the ones we're keeping nowadays are the ones we need to work in IT jobs and health jobs, where young Australians just are not going into those careers.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say. How many are exactly staying and then going on to work in Australia in those fields that we need them in?
We've made it really hard for them to get a migration outcome if they get educated in Australia, and unless they're in a real skill and demand, then they can't get a migration result. However, a number of them get to stay on and work full-time for 3 years after they graduate, which we call a post-study work right visa, which other countries we compete against, like the UK, New Zealand, also have in place. So they can work part-time while they study, but once they graduate from here, they've got a time limit on how long they can stay in the country before they have to go home.
And this new policy that's been announced will divide the visa applications into high and standard priority categories. Do we know exactly how that categorisation will be split?
Well, we appreciate the fact that the government did have an expert panel who've been meeting for several months since the Greens combined with the coalition to stop the cap legislation, ironically, particularly given they passed it in the lower house of Parliament, but then stopped it in the Senate. And what that expert panel have been doing from universities and private colleges is co-designing this new ministerial direction with the government. And to your point, it means that 80% of the caps that were given to each university and other colleges will be given the same priority as everyone else, whereas before I mentioned only the lowest risk universities were getting the lion's share of visas processed timely. And then the other 20% of their number will go into a separate bucket, a priority 2, so that will be slowed down. So effectively, the government are hoping to get to their capped figure that they had in the legislation anyway, but they're going about it by different means.
All right, Phil Honeywood, thanks so much for your time this afternoon. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Christy.